Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and I have a particularly interesting video for you today because it kind of exists in two parts. The first part is a gear review, specifically that of the Weiss Engineering INT-204 digital-to-digital converter and DSD-to-PCM converter. This sells for $1,860 from Vintage King Audio here in the United States. I will put a link down in the description where you can buy this from Vintage King Audio. It will not be an affiliate link. It is just there for your convenience. The other part of this video is that this is going to serve as a comparison of digital-to-digital converters of different price points, because I have this one at $1,860. I have the Singxer SU-6 here at $750, and then I have a first generation Berkeley Alpha USB, which the generation 2 is the one that you can buy new right now, and that sits at about $2,500 in there. And I was able to compare those three DDCs to each other in blind test conditions. In other words, me not knowing which one I was listening to at any given time, and then compare them to each other sonically, and then rank their performances according to those results that I heard. So I think you're going to want to stick around and hear that as well. Okay. Quick disclaimers then about the INT-204. I bought this with channel funds, Daniel Weiss over at Weiss Engineering, and it is Weiss Engineering. I confirmed this with the owner over there. The name W-E-I-S-S is pronounced as Weiss, as in head in A, okay? That sort of thing. Anyway, Daniel Weiss offered me an industry discount to buy this piece with channel funds, so that's what I did. There were no other strings attached other than providing an honest review, which is what you are about to receive. So, after shameless self-promotion, we've got a lot to get to because we've got to talk about the INT-204, and then we got to talk about that blind listening test results with the comparison through these other DDCs, and we got to talk about why you might even buy something like the INT-204 or any other DDC in the first place. So we got a lot to get to, so here we go right after shameless self-promotion.
Hi, it's me again, 14 months later and a whole foot taller. Now, since Wave Theory liked the first 10,000 subscriber play button I made him, maybe he wants a 25,000 subscriber play button. This can only happen if you subscribe, though. Now, since over 60% of the watch time comes from unsubscribed viewers, I'm gonna need you to subscribe. You can also sign up for his Patreon or send him money in PayPal. Links in the description. Now, on to the video.
Alright, as is often the case on my channel, there is a lot to get to in this video, so this could get on the longer side, so I will timestamp all of this out. Jump around, watch the parts that are of most interest and relevance to you. Otherwise, grab a beverage of choice, get comfortable, because we've got a lot to talk about here about the INT-204 and then also this DDC Battle Royale, where I have actual blind test listening results to present to you. Okay. So, about the INT-204 real quick here, and again, it's currently listed at $1,860 on Vintage King's website. I have seen other prices for it over time. It does seem like it's a victim of inflation a little bit, where the price is creeping upward, as just about everything else, because I'm sure part costs and manufacturing and import fees and all of that kind of stuff are starting to have a compounding impact on its price there, as just about any other piece of gear is these days. So there is that to keep in mind. Okay. What is it? It's a digital-to-digital converter, right? It takes a USB audio input from a USB audio source, be that a computer via USB connection playing music software, or a streamer with a USB output, okay, that sort of thing. And it converts that digital audio stream into one of three flavors of SPDIF digital audio output there. The other thing that it does is it does conversion from DSD, or direct stream digital, okay, which is the audio format behind a Super Audio CD, for example, if for the uninitiated there, and it converts it to PCM, or pulse code modulation, the audio format behind just about every other music or digital music format there. It's the format that is found on CD audio, FLAC files, WAV files, etc. They are all pulse code modulation, or PCM. So this piece can be of particular interest to a fairly narrow niche within our hobby here for a couple of reasons. One, if you have an older DAC or even a newer DAC that just eschews having a USB input, newer DACs that do that are rare, but they exist, okay? If you have one of those DACs with no USB input, it only has SPDIF inputs on it, then this device here can serve as a very functional and high-performance bridge between a USB audio source, again, like a computer or streamer, and your SPDIF input only DAC. Okay. The other thing that might be of interest for this device here for some people, even with more modern DACs that do have USB inputs on them, is that it does that DSD to PCM conversion. Okay, shit DAC owners, for example, okay, the Yggdrasil, particularly the Iggy A2, which is a very popular model because of its somewhat unique and pleasing sound for a lot of people, okay, it does not decode DSD. No shit DAC that I know of, or even now or upcoming, decodes DSD, so it might be useful to have something like this on hand if you want to explore the world of DSD with a shit DAC, just as one example. Okay, I picked up this piece and I sought this one out because one of my main DACs is the Berkeley Alpha Series 2. It is an older model right now. It tops out as decoding 24-bit 192 kilohertz PCM files. It does not decode DSD, and it has no USB input on it. In fact, Berkeley, just as their ethos, the way they do outboard USB connections themselves by selling the Alpha USB. I think there's also an Alpha Elite USB. That's another like step above this in quality here. Right, where they do USB to SPDIF conversion on their own as well. So that's like a common thing with Berkeley DACs, just as one example. But the Alpha USB does not do that DSD conversion. So me as a reviewer, I value high performance, obviously, but I also really need a lot of flexibility. And so the ability to connect my Berkeley DAC to a USB source and also do high quality hardware domain DSD to PCM conversion really caught my eye here, and so that's why I was interested in getting one of these in and checking it out here and using it as a piece to do those things that I just spoke of. Now, why might you be interested in a DDC generally over and above the reasons that I just gave? Well, even if you have a DAC that might be a little bit older at this point that has a USB input on it, USB audio protocols of the early days were not very good at noise isolation. Things like galvanic isolation methods and so forth have improved dramatically over recent years, but even if you do have a USB input on your DAC, it's not guaranteed to be the best input to use on that particular DAC. If you find yourself in that situation, then a DDC of any type that does that conversion for you is a good thing to have on hand. Another reason that you might want to use such a thing is that a lot of these DDCs have multiple digital outputs on them that you can use simultaneously. So if you run a multiple DAC setup, but you have a really nice streamer there that you don't want to have to buy a second one or another high-end streamer, you can put something like this in between and convert the USB output of a streamer like that into multiple digital outputs and run multiple DACs in your setup all at once. We audiophiles can do stuff like that because we often have multiple signal chains for, at least on the headphone side of the hobby, different headphones for synergy purposes and different listening experiences. So again, that's another reason you may want to consider a DDC. More information then specifically about the INT-204 here is like it will accept from its USB input PCM files up to sampling rates of 384 kilohertz. Okay, and then of course it will also accept a DSD input. The output options though, since it only outputs via SPDIF, is that if it takes in a 384 kilohertz PCM file, it will step that down to 192 kilohertz output. Likewise, if it gets a 352.8 kilohertz input, it will step that down to a 176.4 output. Is that the right number? I think so. Anyway, okay, and so forth that way. Now, it offers a lot of flexibility in the down conversion and also the DSD conversion, because you see we've got some switches here on the front here. This one to your right is labeled as 88.2 or 176.4, right? And what that is that controls the maximum sampling rate of the output there if you do DSD conversion. Let's say that you have a DAC that tops out at a 96 kilohertz sampling rate. You can't send it a 176 sample rate, so you can switch that to the 88.2. Go back far enough in DAC world, okay, some vintage R2Rs maybe that a lot of people still like to use. Maybe it can't decode a 24-bit input, so you have this other switch here to switch it to a 16-bit output if you need it there. So this will downsample, convert DSD to PCM, but then also downsample if you're listening to a higher resolution source than a vintage DAC can handle there, giving it a lot of flexibility, and again, really being a high quality bridge between more modern sources and more vintage digital to analog converters in there. It also has a remote control that does not come with it. That is a separate purchase here. Here's the sensor for it. That supposedly will do some volume control. I did not get that remote control, so I cannot comment on that feature at all. I just read about it on the features list on their website. All right. Looking at the back panel of the INT-204, we see here that we have a DC power input that can accept DC power ranging from 6 volts to 9 volts. I found some interesting things about the power input here in terms of the amount of volts that you put through there. I will comment on that when we get to the sound section. Here is the USB audio input, and then you see the 3 flavors of SPDIF audio output. You've got the balanced 3-pin XLR connector for AES right there, and then you have 2 flavors of coaxial output in an RCA connector here, SPDIF coaxial, and then a BNC connector here, again, SPDIF coaxial. You see it as a small, compact unit in an aluminum case, all of that, so like it really does not take up a whole lot of room in your system either. The stock power supply is fairly basic. It's just one of these, like, I think it's a medical grade power supply here. It is rated at a 7.5 volt, 2.93 amp output for a maximum of 22 watts of power. According to the website that I read on Weiss Engineering, the current draw of the INT-204 is only about 150 milliamps. So this, on paper, has plenty of power for the INT-204, but I definitely heard some changes again in blind testing conditions with changing the voltage input that you put here, because I have an Uptone Audio JS2 linear power supply that has dual outputs, both of them variable from 5 volts to 12 volts, and so I checked the 7 and 9 volt output on the JS2 and got some interesting results, which we will get to here in a little bit. Okay, with that out of the way, let me kind of explain here like what I discovered about the INT-204's sound and how it stacks up to these other 2 DDCs, and then we will dive into how I discovered those things, because that's going to take a while. I've got to explain the blind test methodology, the gear that I used, and all of that kind of stuff here. So here are the highlights real quick, again, with defenses of these statements to follow. Okay, number 1. The sonic performance of the INT-204, the sound that you can get out of it, is of higher quality than the Singxer SU-6, but it is not quite as good as that first-gen Berkeley Alpha USB that I just showed you. It slots in the middle there. So that's finding number 1. Finding number 2 there is that the input quality matters to the INT-204, and that might sound like a well duh statement, but I get the impression out there that there's a fair slice of our audiophile hobby that thinks that basically as long as you get a decently clean USB source, digital source, you're done. Okay, bits are bits from that point. You don't really have to go up in price and all of that. My blind test results here did not show that to be true. Input quality definitely matters here, and I'll explain that here as we go along as well. Okay, another finding here about the Weiss Engineering INT-204 is that, as I said, the amount of power you get it in terms of voltage matters. I heard a difference between setting my LPS at 7 volts and setting it at 9 volts. So we need to explore that as well. Okay, and then some things that are like syntheses that I heard out of this that like either are no longer blind tests or the blind test results certainly suggest this that we're going to talk about here is that in a sighted test, I do think that the DSD-to-PCM conversion quality that the INT-204 offers is superior to a lot of software solutions, including a pretty good one that is found in Roon. Okay, I'm a Roon user, so I was able to compare there. That part of the test was not blind because I just did not have a good way to set that up in a blind way. Okay, but I did perform that test in a sighted manner after I did the blind testing to see where this slotted in relative to the other DDCs that we're going to talk about here. Okay, the other part of that we need to talk about is like now the question is open, like how much does USB source quality matter, right? How clean can you make your USB? How quality of a streamer can you get in here? Because I've got some evidence to suggest that that definitely makes a difference, but I don't know how high that scales. So these are all things that we're going to talk about here in further detail as the review unfolds. Okay. So then, let me just real quick talk about the sonic character of the INT-204, and then we'll dig into those comparative things and analyses here a little bit further. Okay. The sound of the INT-204 is quite neutral, right? I really was picking up that, like, from a tonal standpoint, it was mostly getting out of the way. From a presentational standpoint, particularly in comparison to, like, the SU-6, which we'll get here in a moment, is, like, it has a quite analog sounding presentation. Like, a lot of digital audio a criticism of digital audio is often that it can sound, like, etched, okay, or harsh, or like and it can have some glare to it. Like it sounds, for lack of a better term, digital. And more analog sources like vinyl or reel-to-reel tape or something like that sound, for lack of a better term, analog. Mostly because they are all analog formats. This DDC, to my ears, did a much better job of something like the SU-6 of sounding like more analog and, for lack of a better term, more musical. Right, it had a smoothness and a refinement to it that just like sounded more natural to my ears, and that just again more lifelike than what the SU-6 was giving me. Okay, and so like there are other things that will come out in the comparison too, but just trying to describe the nature of the INT-204 sound of itself is that tonally it mostly gets out of the way. Presentationally, I think it does a pretty bang up job of like not sounding digital, of like sounding like an analog kind of component going on there. And so like I really appreciated that. It's nice and holographic and it's three-dimensional. It improves the spatial presentation over something like an SU-6 and all of that. And so we're going to get into all of those details here in a little bit, but like just to again try to describe its basic nature, I think it's a really solid, good sounding piece. Now, I will have more specific things to say here as we get further into these comparisons, but that's the baseline to start with here. The other thing is like the small form factor is nice. It's very placement friendly. You can put it basically anywhere that you want to. It is heavy enough that even if you put big, thick, heavy cables in the back of it, it's not going to pop a wheelie on you like some gear can do. And then it's got these nice rubber feet on the bottom that it doesn't really slide around around on whatever you have it sitting on top of either. So those are nice little usage touches that I think are worth mentioning and are marks in its favor. Okay. Now, let's start talking about this blind test stuff here, because that's also going to help flesh out like where the value of the INT-204 falls in and all of that kind of stuff. So what did I do here? So I really wanted to figure out, like, again, can I really truly hear differences in DDC performance? And in certain situations, right? So again, as I said, one of my main DACs is the Berkeley Alpha Series 2, which has no USB input on it, and it has just SPDIF inputs on it in different flavors. It has a single AES input on it, it's got a single Toslink input on it, and then it has a pair of identical BNC coaxial inputs on it. And that was the really key thing here for me to do this comparison work, is because I could set up the system with identical 75 ohm coaxial cables that are terminated BNC on either end, all right, and plug them in, and then either by having someone else hook things up for me or twisting the cables around a whole bunch so I don't know which one goes to which input, I could plug in two DDCs at once, okay, not knowing which DDC was on BNC input 1 and which DDC was on BNC input 2. So at least that created a single blind listening condition where I knew one of them was on one input and the other DDC was on the other input, okay? But I didn't know which was which. And so I could really just listen and say, okay, what's going on input 1? What's going on input 2? Without the influence of knowing which piece I was listening to and like what its price was and whether or not I liked the look of it or anything like that. It could remove those potential biases in there as well. Okay. Provided I could make everything else the same. And this is why blind tests are rare in the review space. I don't think it's because we generally don't want to do them. I know a lot of us would like to do more blind testing than we can do. The issue is like assembling the gear and creating truly equal and truly blind conditions is actually quite difficult. It requires a lot of time, it requires a lot of gear, and then it requires careful setup, and then very often it requires help with that setup, so again, that you do not know what's plugged into what. And then that means you often have to explain to someone who doesn't understand this stuff like you do what goes where and how to do it and things to be careful of, so that it gets very complicated and difficult to do. I, however, have been able to assemble enough gear here that I was able to check this. So I have a pair of identical, other than the case color, FIO SR11 streamers. Now these are entry-level streamers. $109 US, well, 110, because I think it's like 109.99, right? There, and I was able to plug those into two identical, it's all twisted up here, two identical iFi iPowerX 5-volt power supplies, both plugged into the same power strip, okay? And then using identical Pangea USB audio cables, go from those DDCs there, those streamers, USB output into two of the three DDCs at once that I have here. Now, when I plugged all of this in, like I basically had to plug in the coax cables, reach around behind my equipment rack to the back of my Berkeley DAC, find the two BNC plugs by feel, plug in the two BNC coax cables, twist them together a bunch of times, not looking at them so that the two ends come out, and I didn't know which cable went to input 1 and which cable went to input 2. Okay, and then like make sure that the Weiss was always plugged in, and then have the other cable going to either the Singxer or the Berkeley. Okay, there. Okay, now I also have two of those Uptone JS2 LPSs, right? And so what that allowed me to do is, for one thing, I was able to plug the INT-204 into that Uptone JS2, one of the outputs of it. Okay, initially set at 7 volts and then later 9 volts, and I'll explain why. Okay, and then the other DDCs, both of them, the Singxer also accepts a range of input power from 7.5 to 9 volts. So I had to set the JS2 to 9 volts to be able to use that. Then this first generation Berkeley Alpha, the AC power input, the internal power supply failed. So it has been modded to accept a 9 volt DC power input here, which means it has to be used with a linear power supply now that can output 9 volts. I guess it could be a switching mode power supply, but a 9 volt power supply. Okay, so then all of that happened there. So then I could ensure that all of the DDCs also had basically identical power, right? They were all plugged into Uptone JS2s, set for a voltage that works for them. Okay, and then so everything there was the same. Now I did ultimately do a second round of testing with Sonor Ultra Rendu streamers of hardware version 1.3, again making sure we had identical power and identical cabling and everything everywhere. Okay, as like round 2 of the test to us, because I found something interesting about the FIOS here as well. So let's unpack all of this and what I found. All right, when I was using the FIOS streamers and listening to the SU-6, okay, and the INT-204 with 7 volt power, I was listening back and forth, and I was like, okay, there's definitely a difference between the two. I didn't know which one was, you know, on input 1 and which one was on input 2. But one of the inputs was definitely clearer, cleaner, bigger in stage, more holographic, okay, slightly more detailed and resolute. It had a little bit more dynamic impact to it, and just over time was clearly establishing itself as having the overall better sound. Okay, it was not obvious at first in my notes. I could see myself arguing with myself about which one actually sounded a little bit smoother, but I was very consistent in terms of which one of them had like the bigger sound stage, okay, and which ones had a little bit more dynamic impact to it and all of that. And then ultimately settled on the winner as the one that was smoother because it was tonally smoother, very subtly so in there. But there was a clear difference that was consistent in my listening here. And I was like, I bet that means that the INT-204 is sounding better. So I looked, after I was confident I was hearing a difference, I looked at what was plugged into what, and found that in that blind test condition, I had clearly preferred the Singxer SU-6. I was crestfallen because I was really hoping that the INT-204 was going to give me an upgrade over the SU-6. And so at that point, I was pretty distraught, and I was about ready to take the INT-204 here and throw it through the window. Because even if I even if it's not as good as the SU-6 and I try to sell it, I'm going to take a loss on it, because this review would be out there where I say, yeah, it's not as good as the SU-6. And so I would take quite a hit financially if I indeed had to sell it. But then I happened to remember, wait, maybe I should change from the 7 volt output of the JS2 to the 9 volt output and try again. The issue being, though, is like I now know which DAC is, or which DDC is on which input, so I've got to get some help, plug this in again, so that I can blind test that again. So get down on my belly, crawl around behind the equipment rack, get the little screwdriver out to adjust the output voltage on the JS2 that was powering the INT-204, adjust it from 7 volts to 9 volts, all of that, unplugged the BNC cables from both the INT and the 204 and the SU-6, called my partner downstairs and told her, okay, here are 2 identical BNC cables here. Here's where they get plugged into and how you hook them up. What I need you to do is take this quarter, and I handed her a quarter, okay? Pick one of these, put it in your hand, flip that quarter. If it's heads, put that cable on what was the Singxer, okay? And then because the cables looked identical and I still didn't know which end I was holding, like which one was on input 2 and which one was on input 1, all that. Okay, just plug that one in and then I can reach around behind the system where the INT-204 is and plug the other one in, and I won't be able to tell or know, again, which one's on input 1, which one's on input 2. So I left the room, she flipped that coin, she plugged one of them in, I came in, plugged the other one in, and even if I could see the inputs on the SU-6, or excuse me, on the Berkeley, there's just still no way I could tell with all of that, what was going on back there, which one was on input 1, which one was on input 2, so I'm confident this was, again, a blind test condition here. All right, so then now with the INT-204 on 9-volt power, I reran the test between the SU-6 and the INT-204, and I really could not reliably tell a difference anymore. I really could not, and I worked really hard to. This was like, if I ear squinted, I could maybe make a claim that one of them had just a little bit narrower sounding center image, and the other one had maybe just a slightly weightier tone. But it was so close that I could not confidently say that consistently. And so that was like, I just eventually, after about 10 tracks or so, going back and forth, trying to figure out if there were any differences there, I just threw up my hands and said, these two sound the same in this test condition. Okay? But that surprised me, and I still wasn't exactly happy because, again, I wanted the INT-204 to be better than the Singxer SU-6 because I paid money for it. It was not cheap, even with the discount, and I was looking for an upgrade, okay? So I was like, well, I've got this, chimera of a Berkeley Alpha USB around. Even though it has been modified, it in theory should sound significantly better than either of these two. So I still didn't know which BNC cable was on input 1 and which BNC cable was on input 2. So I swapped out the Singxer. So I pulled that one out, put the Berkeley in its place, thinking, like, if any of differences are going to arrive, like, surely this Berkeley will sound better. Okay? No. Again, they sounded virtually identical, okay, to each other, and I could not pull out any meaningful and consistent differences between the two. So that told me that in this test condition, that all three of these DDCs here sounded pretty much the same, and I was like, oh boy, the bits are bits people are gonna love this, okay? All right. The other thing that showed, though, and this is like kind of one of the points that I made there, is like the 7-volt versus 9-volt power into the INT-204 did make a difference because it went from clearly lagging behind the SU-6 to being at least equal to it, okay, in that testing condition with the FIO SR11 streamers as the source. So that input power definitely mattered, 9 volts being better than 7 volts. So that is something to keep in mind there. Okay. Now, at this point, again, I'm still kind of frustrated and getting a little worried, but then I remember, the FIO SR11 streamers, I like them. I think they are really solid products, but they are entry level. And at this point, I'm like, okay, I guess I do have to go through, just for thoroughness and to be sure, I do have to go through the effort of pulling and snaking cables around behind my equipment rack again and all of that, making sure that I like covered up the back of the Berkeley Alpha and all of that so I still can't see which BNC cable is going into which input because I was the only one in the house at that point. I couldn't get help on this one until somebody else got home, and I wanted to get this done. So I made sure I covered that up, couldn't see what was going on there. Okay, and then powered things down or switched input so that if I unplugged one thing, a screen wouldn't go blank and give it away and, that kind of stuff. Okay, just made sure that all of that so I could maintain a blind condition. All right, And so then made sure that the Ultra Rendus had, again, equal power input to them. They had, again, equal USB, identical USB cables, those Pangea cables that I mentioned in there. Both of those Ultra Rendus are hardware version 1.3 with the latest firmware update on. Make sure they were all up to date, that they were just basically everything was as identical, same brand and length of network cabling going into them, just like all of that stuff plugged into the same network switch. Okay, all of that to make sure it was as equal as I could get it, and that the only thing different in the signal chain was the DDC. Okay, other than that, and again, this is why blind tests are very hard to do, because like you've got to make sure that all of that stuff, that you're just eliminating variables, which means you've got to have two of everything. And of course, a DAC that has like identical inputs like my Berkeley does, and not every DAC offers that option. Okay, so again, it gets challenging. All right, but once I got all of that set up and ready to go, leaving the INT-204 on 9-volt power and so forth, now I rerun the test, and the SU-6 and the INT-204 are the two that were plugged in, and then it was just like, bang, immediately. And I mean immediately, I could tell a difference between the sounds of input 1 and input 2. In this case, input 2 had a much bigger soundstage, more three-dimensional, more holographic, more resolving, cleaner, clearer, more clarity. It was both more refined and defined in its sound, more dynamic impact, more rumble, more slam, more believable, more natural timbre. Everything was better. Okay, just about everything was just like an obvious wholesale improvement. There was not really a single technical thing that I could find about input 1 that was superior to what I was hearing from input 2. Okay. And again, that result was immediate and stood in stark contrast to the first round of testing that I did with the SR11 streamers as the source, where everything sounded pretty much the same and I was really struggling to pull out differences. Okay, again, the contrast here of how immediate the differences came forward was also key here. All right. So then I'm like, okay, cool. Let me grab that Berkeley Alpha USB again and swap it out with the SU-6. Okay. And again, immediately, now input 1 was superior. Everything that I just said about like the more holographic soundstage, okay, the three-dimensionality of it, the smoothness, the increased definition and clarity, the better tonality, the more even tonal balance, the more natural timbre, okay, even the impact of the sound and all of that, it's just immediately and obviously came forward on input 1 more than on input 2. Okay, so it took like one track to figure out immediately what had happened, and that was that the Singxer started out on BNC input 1 on my Berkeley, and the Weiss started on BNC input 2. And so when I swapped out the alpha for the SU-6, it went on input 1, again, without my beforehand knowledge. And I could very, very clearly pull out the differences between these DDCs using their BNC outputs into the BNC inputs on my Berkeley DAC. Okay, and I very clearly could tell in order of like sonic performance and also my preference as to which one I liked better. Berkeley Alpha on the top, Weiss INT-204 in the middle, Singxer SU-6 bringing up the rear here. All of them sounding really good. I want to emphasize that I was getting really good sound from all of them. It was just better going from SU-6 to INT-204 and then from INT-204 to the Alpha USB. Okay? And again, significantly easy to tell the differences, and like these were very obvious differences here on this one. And they, again, revealed themselves immediately which stands in contrast to the cheaper sources that happened earlier. So, the conclusions that I can very confidently take from this this testing here. The INT-204 is a definite sonic upgrade from the Singxer SU-6, provided that you give it 9 volt of input power. Okay, 9 volts of input power there with a good, clean, linear power supply. And you give it a fairly high quality USB source. If your USB source is kind of terrible, okay, I don't want to call the SR11s terrible here, but you definitely get a garbage in, garbage out kind of scenario going here on here with the INT-204. So its sonic performance ceiling is noticeably higher than what the SU-6 gives you there under those conditions. But then again, something like the Berkeley Alpha USB, which this is Gen 1 that has been modified, and Gen 2 is the one you buy new now, okay, just steps it up that much more, okay, sounding quite incredible there. So then it was just a matter of, well, like, how good is the DSD to PCM conversion of the INT-204? Because that's really one of the selling points of it. And so I left the Berkeley and the INT-204 plugged into the Berkeley DAC at this point. And so now it's a sided test because I knew the Alpha USB was on BNC 1 and the Weiss was on BNC 2 at this point. And then I set one of the Ultra Rendus, the one that goes into the Berkeley Alpha USB, to not output DSD, to let Rune do its own DSD conversion internally, so that the Ultra Rendu only puts out PCM that the Berkeley Alpha USB can accept. And then I let the other Ultra Rendu streamer just output DSD losslessly into the INT-204. Again, in a sided test condition here, but I really did pick up that the gap between the performance of the INT-204 and the performance of the Berkeley Alpha USB closed noticeably. The Berkeley Alpha USB was still the superior sounding option at that point, but it was not pulling ahead as far as it did when it was PCM versus PCM. Okay? So that's a key thing to keep in mind here, and it's something I should have said earlier. I apologize for not. Like, I was doing all PCM files for the previous comparisons here, because if I had picked a DSD file, it could very well have given away which one was the INT-204 and which one was not. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. All right. Okay, but yeah, so that to me, that told me that the PCM to DSD conversion in the INT-204 is likely superior to what even Rune is doing, and I think Rune does a pretty good job of that, but it wasn't good enough to overcome the performance gap that the Alpha USB has over the INT-204 generally. Okay, that's just something to keep in mind on there if that is of interest to you, but still sounds really good, okay, from the INT-204. Those are the main points there about the INT-204 itself. It's really an excellent DDC. It sounds quite fantastic. It had just a more analog and believable sound to it over the cheaper DDC, which is the SU-6, so it gives you a noticeable upgrade there sonically, and then it does a really good job with that DSD to PCM conversion. You do have to be careful about the power that you give it. You do have to be careful about the USB signal quality that you give it as well. Those things definitely matter. Okay, as far as features go that might make a decision for you, the Singxer SU-6 has more outputs on it, right? Like, you've got I2S, okay, in 2 different flavors with HDMI connectors and also the RJ45 style. You've got a Toast-Link output on it if you want. You have 2 coax outputs, 1 RCA and 1 BNC if you want it. You also have a clock output there if you want it there. So there are some features to the SU-6 that could make it more attractive to some, particularly if you're looking for an I2S connection, or you have just a crazy number of DACs that maybe aren't as high-end as like my Berkeley Alpha DAC or all that. And the Singxer SU-6 still does sound very good. I'm still going to continue to use it as a reference in some systems because it's still very good at what it does for its price. Okay, it's just that the INT-204 is better. The INT-204 then, of course, also offers that DSD-to-PCM conversion as a key feature, even though it has fewer outputs. So again, I think with some DACs out there, that's very much going to be an attractive feature. The Alpha USB is easily the best sounding of these, but it's very feature limited, right? Like, it only has the AES and BNC coax output, and you have to manually switch between the two rather than them just being active at the same time as the outputs are with the other two. Okay, so that's kind of the wrap up on the INT-204. The other thing that this blind testing thing showed me here is that streamer quality does seem to matter. And also DDC quality, at least if you're going to an SPDIF output, also really matters. I don't know how high those things scale, though. Like, I don't know at what point the law of diminishing returns kicks in, if it really even kicks in at all, as far as we've been able to advance the technology to this point. I don't know. So that's an unanswered question here going forward. Another thing to keep in mind is if you have a really high quality USB input on your DAC already, do I know if any of these DDCs are going to best that by using one of its outputs? Like, are you still, even if you do have a DAC with a nice USB input, are you going to get better sound from any of these connecting via SPDIF from either the INT-204 or the Berkeley Alpha, okay, or in the Singxer, in the case of the Singxer, maybe I2S? Are you going to get better sound there? I don't know. That is a much more difficult blind test to set up. Much more difficult blind test to set up and execute, short of having two identical DACs and a reliable and clean switch box in there to be able to use. I have switchers and all of that. I don't have two identical DACs where I can really test this in a true blind setup in there. So I can't answer that question either. So the result that I gave in this video, we must keep in mind, is for SPDIF outputs, okay, on DACs using an SPDIF input there. So just file that away in your brain too. All right, but we'll go ahead and wrap it up there because I know this is a lot, but I thought it was really interesting, but I'm a nerd about these things. INT-204, pretty good. Okay, does get my recommendation. It is arguably a little bit pricey, especially since like the $2,500 Berkeley Alpha USB is out there and provides probably fairly, significantly better sound there, but it doesn't do the DSD to PCM conversion. So I think there really is a place in the market for the INT-204 because of that PCM or DSD PCM conversion. And so it's fairly easy to recommend on those grounds. Okay. So thanks to Daniel Weiss for, selling this to me at a discount and sending it over, and he's been very responsive about my questions. He says there are no longevity concerns running it at 9 volts, if that is of worry to you. So don't worry about that. It'll run a little bit warmer, but he says it won't affect its lifespan at all. So that's important there. Thanks to all of you for watching and sticking this out and listening to me nerd out and ramble on about these listening tests that I did. But I hope it was all useful information for you. All right, so thanks again for watching. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment, check out my PayPal, my Patreon. Also consider becoming a channel member. Generally do those things you do to support YouTube channels. And as always, enjoy the music.